Hey guys, alright? Welcome everyone. It all begins in the final phase of World War II, in 1945. Here, we see Japanese pilot Koichi Shikishima making an emergency landing on a small Pacific island. There, he reunites with Air Force colleague Sasako Tachibana, who congratulates him on successfully landing his rusty plane on such a rugged island. Shikishima mentions that despite being a specialist, thanks to training missions, he became a kamikaze. Tachibana then remarks on Shikishima's strange landing, as they had checked his plane and everything was in order, leading Shikishima to believe that Tachibana considers him a coward who sought an excuse not to die in battle as he should have. However, Tachibana, taking advantage of their solitude, says he understands Shikishima, considering it ridiculous to die honorably when the war has already ended. After observing the sea expelling dead animals, Shikishima returns to the cabin, where he and the mechanics are alerted by a battle alarm. Tachibana thinks it might be another American atomic bomb, but when they illuminate the beach, they discover a creature emerging. One of the mechanics recognizes it as Godzilla, thanks to the tales he's heard about the monster. Tachibana understands that fighting head-on is useless, ordering the men to take cover. In the trenches, Shikishima asks what kind of beast Godzilla is, and Tachibana explains that no one knows. He then asks Shikishima, the only soldier present, to run and retrieve the 20mm gun. Shikishima hesitates, fearing only to enrage Godzilla, but Tachibana insists that the weapon can kill anything. Shikishima leaves the trench and stealthily approaches his plane. However, when aiming at Godzilla, he freezes in fear, worsened when Godzilla looks at him threateningly. The mechanics' fear causes them to fire, and although Tachibana orders them to cease fire, this angers the mighty Godzilla, who destroys the trench and begins to crush the mechanics. His uncontrolled rage also attacks Shikishima's plane, but we see that he manages to escape in time. The next day, Shikishima wakes up and discovers that all the mechanics have died, except Tachibana, who blames him for not shooting when ordered. Months later, Shikishima and the surviving Japanese soldiers are transported back to their country on a rescue ship, and Tachibana hands Shikishima photos of the deceased mechanics. Days later, in Tokyo, Shikishima navigates through the debris of the destroyed city, but upon arriving home, discovers that it has been bombed. However, he reunites with his neighbor Sumiko Oda, who initially does not understand how he is alive, being on a kamikaze pilot mission. When she understands that he fled from honorable death, she treats him as a coward in disgrace, believing that Japan lost the war because of weak soldiers like him. Shikishima ignores her contempt to ask about her parents, but Sumiko clarifies that they all died in the bombing fire, including her children. Later, Shikishima decides to read his father's last letter, where he asks him to come back alive. Afterwards, when Shikishima is enjoying post-war soup, a chase begins against a woman. Trying to stop her, she hands him her daughter and moves on. As Shikishima is a poor and homeless soldier, he plans to abandon the baby, but later changes his mind. Soon, he is found by the mother of the child, Noriko, who retrieves her daughter and asks why he didn't leave her. Shikishima explains that he couldn't abandon a baby to its fate. This catches Noriko's attention, who decides to follow him. Together, they reach the remains of his home, where they use utensils to cook. She reveals that the baby's name is Akiko and is not her daughter, but was entrusted to her during the bombing by the dying mother. Shikishima asks why she dresses like a harlot, but says he doesn't judge her, as he understands she needs to survive somehow. Noriko claims not to be such a thing, and upon learning that Shikishima lost his parents in the bombing, realizes that they are both alike. Before Shikishima can drive her away, Noriko falls asleep. The next day, when going out to fetch water, Sumiko confronts him, asking if he thinks he's a saint for taking in a woman and a child, and makes it clear that it's too late for him to become a hero, and that she won't count on his help. However, when she discovers that Noriko is not the baby's mother and therefore is not breastfeeding, we see that Sumiko decides to examine the child. Upon doing so, she discovers that if the baby doesn't feed soon, she will die of malnutrition, so she gives her portion of rice, even if it means going hungry. In March 1946, when Shikishima returns home after looking for work, he informs Noriko that he has found a government-sponsored job with a good salary. However, the job involves finding mines laid during the war. Noriko refuses to take such a risk, but Shikishima reminds her that at this rate, they will starve to death, and that's why he accepted the job, promising that he won't die. Upon arriving at the port, he discovers that the boat they will use is no bigger than a small sailboat. There, he meets his colleagues, including elderly former naval officer Kenji Noda, who explains that they must find 60,000 mines laid by Japan and the United States along their own shores. He mentions that they will use these small wooden boats because any metal boat could activate them. He then introduces the rest of the team, Captain Yoji Akitsu and Shiro Mitsushi, considered a boy for not having been in the war. Akitsu explains that their boat is tethered with a cable to another boat, whose function will be to sail along the coast to cut the connections of the underwater bombs, which are then brought to the surface and detonated with shots. When Shikishima observes the captain's poor aim, he offers to try and successfully detonates the mine. However, upon revealing that he has never been in battle, Mitsushi says that they are both the same. Shikishima gets angry and threatens him, making it clear who will strike him if he repeats that. Later, Shikishima is awakened from a nightmare where Godzilla attacks his neighborhood. Noriko offers him tea to calm him down, but he refuses to tell her that his nightmares are because of Godzilla but demonstrates his traumas by lunging at her, asking if he really returned alive to Japan, but calms down when she pushes him away. In July 1946, during Operation Crossroads in the region now known as the Bikini Atoll, part of the ocean filled with test ships is consumed by the explosion of 2 atomic bombs, which also awakens Godzilla. Years later, as Akiko grows up, Shikishima continues to work, and with the money earned, he rebuilds his house. One day, his colleagues visit him and everything goes well until they discover that Noriko and Shikishima are not married. He explains that Noriko arrived with Akiko, who is also not his daughter but an orphan from the bombing, and that he let them stay because they had nowhere else to go. Akiko calls Shikishima dad, but he reminds her that they don't have such a bond. The captain intervenes, explaining that it was fate that brought them together, and that he must accept his role as Akiko's father, but Shikishima refuses. The next day, when returning from work, Shikishima finds Noriko in a new dress, as she got a job in an office. He doesn't understand her motives, but she explains that she decided to start supporting herself because she doesn't want to be a burden, allowing him to find a wife. Shikishima reluctantly accepts. Later, news spreads across the country that an American ship has been attacked, and the culprit, who is Godzilla, has been successfully photographed disappearing into the ocean. Thanks to one of their submarines, they now know that Godzilla will reach the Japanese archipelago in a few weeks. However, movements of the Soviet fleet prevent the US military from mobilizing their troops to help Japan, so their defense will depend on themselves. We arrive in May 1947, near the Ogasawara Islands, where Shikishima's crew reaches the destroyed American ship. They don't understand what kind of weapon or creature could cause such damage. After a long time, Shikishima remembers Godzilla and confirms it when he sees deep-sea fish emerging to the surface, as on Oto Island. He begins to explain that it was there that he met Godzilla, a dinosaur-like monster. Akitsu believes he is confused, but Shikishima reveals that it was the creature that destroyed the entire garrison on the island, not the Americans, as everyone believes. Upon hearing this, his companions discover that Shikishima was a kamikaze pilot. The crew understands that they were sent to the site by the Japanese government, deceived, as they want them to face Godzilla. However, Noda reveals that he was aware and accepts to die for his country. He proposes to gain time until the Japanese ship Takao, coming from Singapore, returns, planning to use the recovered mines. He makes it clear that government orders are to keep everything secret. Later, when they are alone, Noda approaches Shikishima to tell him that he understands him, as sometimes, when he remembers the war, he also can't sleep. Shikishima says he wants to avenge his mechanic comrades, but at the same time, he is afraid of Godzilla. At that moment, they discover that the deep-sea fish have returned to the surface, which means that Godzilla is nearby. Shikishima sounds the alarms and suggests fleeing, but Akitsu refuses to retreat before the ship arrives, as that would mean Godzilla will destroy Tokyo. Godzilla emerges from the depths and destroys the other mine-laying boat, submerging it completely. Upon seeing this, Akitsu reconsiders and orders the retreat, but the engine suffers a brief malfunction and only recovers when Godzilla is almost reaching them. A pursuit begins, and to try to drive Godzilla away, they release the first mine and detonate it right in the creature's face, but Godzilla emerges as if nothing had happened. Then, Shikishima takes over as gunner and, despite his fear, decides to shoot, but the 9mm projectiles they handle are useless. They launch the second mine, which Godzilla devours without fear. When they try to detonate it, they discover that the cable has been cut by Godzilla's teeth. However, Shikishima resumes continuous fire, aiming directly at the mouth of the great Godzilla, and manages to detonate the bomb. The explosion stops the creature and even causes its blood to splatter on the boat, but soon the crew observes that Godzilla's wounds regenerate in seconds. Godzilla rises and roars in a sign of attack, but fortunately, he begins to be bombarded by the newly arrived warship. The firepower of the ship forces Godzilla to submerge, but it's all a trap, as he soon returns and attacks the ship, destroying its cannons. Nevertheless, the Japanese manage to hit Godzilla with another missile, which, being so close, hits him head-on, making him submerge again. But no one defeats Godzilla, and moments later, he activates his nuclear cannon and destroys the warship from below. Emerging, he lets out a roar of victory and, apparently satisfied, decides to leave, leaving Shikishima's crew in peace. When Shikishima wakes up, he is in the hospital, surrounded by comrades, who explain that they were brought by rescuers and that the government does not know Godzilla's location, nor is it interested in making it public to avoid panic and confusion. Upon arriving home, Noriko sees his wounds and asks him to tell her what happened, but Shikishima makes it clear that he won't speak. Noriko knows that he is suffering in secret and asks him to share his burdens with her. So, Shikishima decides to reveal that he is a kamikaze who did not fulfill his duty and therefore lives tormented by shame because on the day he was chosen, he lied saying that his plane was damaged to abandon the route and land on Oto Island. Now, he can only observe the photos of the mechanics who died on that island because when Godzilla appeared, he didn't have the courage to shoot. Moreover, after many years, Godzilla appeared again, and again he couldn't do anything to prevent the deaths of his Japanese comrades. Noriko says that those who survived the war deserve to live, and she knows this because when her parents died in the fire, they ordered her to survive, and that's why she never gave up. Shikishima explains that it's not so easy because the ghosts of the mechanics haunt him in his sleep, and he even believes that maybe he's dead and his whole life with her and Akiko was an illusion. Seeing him collapse, Noriko throws herself on him to comfort him and make it clear that he is alive. Later, upon waking up, Shikishima asks the spirits of the mechanics if he can leave all his past behind and start living for real. Meanwhile, we see that one of Japan's ships discovers that Godzilla has returned and is heading for Tokyo. Soon, the defense of the bay is informed, so they ask permission from their superiors to initiate the attack. When Godzilla crosses the 4th delimited zone, they detonate the mines they had placed, but the explosion does not affect the King of Monsters. Godzilla's inevitable arrival activates alarms in the city, and through the radio, Shikishima learns that the monster is approaching the coast of Ginza, where Noriko works. There, we see that the population runs desperately as they try to evacuate the city, but it's already too late because Godzilla has just entered. As a first act, he throws a container onto the subway tracks where Noriko is traveling, and she becomes a witness to the existence of Godzilla, Shikishima's nightmare creature. For some reason, Godzilla hates the subway, as he launches himself onto it to split it in half with the power of his jaw. All passengers, except Noriko, fall into the void, as she manages to hold onto an iron bar and only lets go when Godzilla throws the remains of the subway into the sea. After that, Godzilla continues to destroy the buildings simply by bumping into the structures, striking the buildings with his hands and his powerful tail. Faced with this, Noriko loses all hope of surviving, so she stands still while the rest of the people rush past her in despair. But right then, Shikishima arrives, forcing her to get up and run for her life. Then, Japan responds by initiating a bombardment from the land tanks, flooding the sky with dust, not knowing if it had an effect or not, until Godzilla becomes enraged and decides to activate his nuclear mode. The spines of his radioactive body emerge, and he launches a nuclear mass destruction cannon that devastates everything in its path in an instant, while the shockwave eradicates the people in the vicinity. In that moment, Noriko decides to save Shikishima by throwing him into an alley so that the buildings can protect him from the debris. When the wind subsides, Shikishima emerges from his hiding spot to look for Noriko, but only finds a devastated terrain with no signs of life, only Godzilla admiring his apocalyptic creation of the world. When Godzilla leaves, the authorities begin rescue efforts, estimating that around 30,000 people have died. Although relatives try to help in collecting the bodies, the authorities prevent them, as Godzilla left a radioactive trail. Afterward, Shikishima's comrades gather at his house to offer their condolences. Amidst this, when Akiko asks for her mother, Sumiko decides to lie and say that Noriko will be away because of work. Akiko's crying breaks Shikishima's calmness, who is on the verge of an emotional breakdown. But then, he looks at the photos of the mechanics and their families and realizes that their spirits have not forgiven him yet. Later, Noda approaches to reveal that the army is planning a counterattack and is recruiting ordinary citizens, so he offers him to join. After everything he has experienced, Shikishima's hatred for Godzilla is greater than his fear, so he accepts. Once there, we see that the entire boat crew has also joined. There, they meet former Captain Tatsuo Hoda, who commanded a destroyer in the war. He explains that Japan does not have the strength to face Godzilla, and any intervention from their allies would escalate tension with the Soviets. But, thanks to diplomacy, Japan managed to obtain 4 destroyers to defend itself. Faced with this, the civilians who were once sailors remember that Godzilla had already destroyed warships, which would mean sending them to certain death. So, Noda takes the floor and explains that the plan the Navy wants to execute was planned by him. He goes on to explain that Godzilla has proven immune to the artillery that Japan possesses, so they discovered that if they manipulate the physics of more bubbles into a kind of armor the size of Godzilla, they can capture him and sink the monster into the Sagami Trench, the deepest point in the surrounding waters with 1,500 meters deep, where the pressure will burst Godzilla's body. He explains that they will use 2 destroyers to tie Godzilla with cables that have Freon tanks, which react when the ships release a cloud of gas, causing Godzilla to sink instantly into the trench. And if their plan fails, then they will use the rescue raft equipment to force Godzilla to surface instantly, which will trigger his body's explosion due to massive decompression. With all this, and since victory is not guaranteed, some show reluctance to accept, as they do not want to return to war, so they withdraw. However, when one of them understands that the plan does not mean as certain death as war, he accepts, followed by another man who understands that it is the right thing to do and that only they can navigate these ships. Thanks to him, the rest also joined. Later, during dinner, Noda tells his companions that, according to his calculations, Godzilla will return to Tokyo in at most 10 days, and they are sure that he will fall into the trap because they will guide him with acoustically recorded sonar buoys of the same creature. When Godzilla hears it, he will believe that there is another Godzilla invading his territory. Shikishima intervenes to assure that if they get him a combat plane, he can enrage Godzilla and guide him to the trench. Noda warns him that Godzilla radiates a heat wave that could cook him if he gets too close, but Shikishima doesn't care. So when Akitsu mentions that avenging Noriko by risking his life in such a stupid way won't bring her back, Shikishima shows he doesn't care, but when Akitsu reproaches him for not marrying Noriko, he apologizes, saying he didn't because his war is not over yet. The next day, Noda shows Shikishima that despite the prohibitions for losing the war, he managed to obtain a military plane of a model that was never launched because the war ended, and that it was designed to shoot down bombers, as it has 30mm cannons. However, since the plane was forgotten, it needs maintenance, and for that, a great mechanic familiar with combat planes is required. Immediately, Shikishima thinks of Tachibana, but when he visits the Air Force records, he discovers that Tachibana does not have a reference address and the office is full of location requests. Shikishima doesn't give up and looks for the address where Tachibana lived before the war to send him letters blaming him for the mechanic's deaths. One day, when Shikishima returns home, he is intercepted by Tachibana, who is there to demand explanations about the letters. Shikishima explains that it was the only way to get his attention and that he now needs his help to repair the plane that will guide Godzilla into the trap. Tachibana initially refuses to help, but Shikishima tells him that he managed to detonate a mine in Godzilla's mouth and now knows that he can kill him by filling his throat with explosives, becoming a kamikaze pilot. Tachibana understands that Shikishima is still at war, just like him, and therefore accepts. Once in the workshop, Tachibana and the men he brought start the repairs. After several days, Noda supervises the preparations on the destroyers, still not happy, as he knows they need a miracle to triumph. However, Akitsu points out that all the men there know they are risking their lives, but now they know they will make a difference. Suddenly, Sector 9 alarms are activated, and upon checking the reports, they discover that they have just received readings of multiple bubbles coming from the east, which means Godzilla is approaching the trap and will reach the Sagami Trench by dawn. As a final order, Noda asks them to return home to spend their last hours with their families, reminding them that Japan did not value the lives of its men in the war, where many died of hunger, boats had defects in their armor, planes without ejection seats, and finally, the existence of kamikaze pilots and suicide attacks. As they leave, Mizushima says he is happy for the battle, but Noda and Akitsu make it clear that he will not participate due to his injuries and should be proud of not participating in any war, as they leave the future in their hands. While everyone rests, we see that Tachibana and the mechanics continue working on the final details of the plane. Tachibana notes that even this model also lacked ejection seats. On the other hand, Shikishima reunites with Akiko and thanks Sumiko for everything she has done for them. which makes the neighbors suspicious. Later, when Akiko shows the drawing she made of her family, she starts crying because she believes that Shikishima will also leave like her mother. After reassuring her, Shikishima lets her sleep and returns to the base hangar, where Tachibana welcomes him and shows that he managed to equip the plane with 2 bombs, one in the nose and the other in the fuselage, all in exchange for removing the heavy artillery, so he can die as the kamikaze he always should have been. Still, Shikishima realizes that part of his body wants to live, but remembering Godzilla killing his and the mechanics, he understands that he cannot back down, as he now also must protect Akiko. Before anything else, Tachibana points out a lever and warns him that it is the fuses for the bombs and he must activate it before impacting Godzilla's throat. Meanwhile, when Akiko wakes up, she takes the envelope that Shikishima left for Sumiko, and we see that inside there is a large sum of money along with a letter asking her to take care of Akiko. The girl asks for her father, but Sumiko reassures her that everything is fine. After that, we see that one of the surveillance stations discovers that at buoy 31, several deep-sea fish are emerging, which means Godzilla is approaching. While the bait team with the fake Godzilla sound mobilizes, Noda orders to start boarding the destroyer. However, they soon observe that the bait is destroyed and that Godzilla is approaching the beach. Faced with this, Shikishima initiates his flight in the plane, and his companions recognize him, so Akitsu warns him that he won't forgive him if he tries to sacrifice himself and leave Akiko orphaned, but Shikishima ignores him and continues with his secret plan. At the same time, Sumiko receives a mysterious telegram. When Godzilla enters the towns near the city, he is intercepted by Shikishima, who flies close to his teeth as a provocation, and thus, after shooting at him with machine guns, he makes him chase him into the sea. Seeing this, Tatsuo Hoda orders the destroyers to prepare for battle, and when Godzilla submerges enough, Hoda sends 2 destroyers in the first attack. Such action by the soldiers angers Godzilla, who in retaliation, activates his nuclear mode and launches the energy cannon into the ocean, unleashing gigantic waves and raising the temperature of the area. The sailors advise to evacuate the destroyer, as it will not withstand another attack like that, but Noda explains that Godzilla needs to recharge his body for a while to launch another attack, so Hoda orders to attack. Thus, we see that as they approach, the front destroyers launch metal cables with levitation devices into the sea, and while these surround him, Shikishima springs into action to distract Godzilla. Due to the docking maneuver, the destroyers fail to avoid colliding lightly with each other, but still survive. When Godzilla realizes, it's already too late, as the cables have already surrounded his body. Godzilla understands this as another lack of respect, and since he had time to recharge, we see that he activates the nuclear mode again. Just before firing, Noda orders to activate the levitation devices, causing Godzilla to sink rapidly, and this is added to the Freon explosion, which pushes him into the depths while the cables immobilize his movements until he reaches the bottom of the trench and touches the abyss. Then, Noda continues with Plan B and activates the life rafts, which proceed to drag Godzilla to the surface at full speed against his will. But when he reaches 800 meters deep, the cables stop because Godzilla breaks the airbags. Thus, Hoda orders to put all the power of the destroyers to pull Godzilla towards the surface, even if it means the destruction of the ships. Soon, one of the cranes falls, interrupting the tension of the cables. But then, to the battlefield comes the tugboat driven by Mizushima, who also brought with him an entire fleet of private boats that want to help. Thus, the tugboats join forces with the destroyers and begin to pull the monster until they finally force him to surface. Although his body suffers decompression, we see that his thick skin manages to resist the damage and, now that they have him in front of them, Godzilla activates the nuclear mode, ready to disintegrate everyone present. But at that moment, Shikishima returns to the battle, flying directly towards Godzilla. After remembering Noriko one last time, he pulls the lever and the plane crashes into Godzilla's mouth, and moments later the bombs explode, shattering his head and extinguishing his radioactive light. Everything indicates that Shikishima died, but soon his friends discover that he survived thanks to the ejection seat of the plane, as Tachibana introduced it at the last moment and guided Shikishima to activate it. Then, as Godzilla's body no longer resists, his skin cracks, and from it begins to escape the radioactive energy, to later fragment and lose itself in the depths. Faced with this, the Japanese bid him farewell, saluting him, because despite everything, Godzilla earned their respect. Once they return to Tokyo, they are received as heroes, and from the crowd emerges Sumiko, who hands Shikishima the telegram she received, as she discovers that Noriko was found alive among the rubble. Quickly he goes to the hospital, and facing Noriko, Shikishima throws himself into her arms while accepting that his war has finally ended. The scene changes and we see that the remains of Godzilla, which are falling into the trench, still have life, as they are regenerating, showing that the king of the monsters is indestructible.